peace with whatever was coming next. He never pouted for cameras, never lobbied for shots in the post-game press conference, never made a single all-star team in nearly 2 decades of professional basketball. He just showed up, did his work in the paint, cashed his checks, and let louder men collect the credit. Now, if you were watching basketball in the 80s and 90s, and a lot of you were, you remember those Pistons. You remember those Bulls. You remember the stars, the wars, the rivalries that defined an era. But be honest. When you think about those championship rosters, does the name James Edwards come to mind? For most people, the answer is no, and that's what makes this story worth telling. Not because Edwards was cheated, not because he was wronged, but because a man played at the highest level for 19 years, won 3 titles with 2 of the most iconic teams ever assembled, and somehow became invisible in plain sight. But to understand how that happened, you have to go back to Seattle in the early 1970s, where James Edwards was anything but overlooked. James Franklin Edwards was born on November 22, 1955 in Seattle, Washington. Long before the city became known for tech money and coffee chains, it was quietly producing basketball talent, and Edwards was one of the first to put Seattle hoops on the map. At Roosevelt High School, he was the biggest kid on the floor and the most skilled. In 1973, Edwards led Roosevelt to the Washington State Big School Basketball Championship. In a city that would eventually send players like Spencer Haywood, Jamal Crawford, Brandon Roy, and Nate Robinson to the league, Edwards was an early signal that Seattle could grow elite talent from its own soil. He stayed home for college, enrolling at the University of Washington to play under coach Marv Harshman. It was a decision that kept him out of the national spotlight. No UCLA, no Kentucky, no North Carolina, but Edwards didn't need a famous program to dominate. As a senior in the 1976-77 season, he averaged 20.9 points and 10.4 rebounds per game. He was a problem in the post, physical, patient, with a soft touch around the rim that didn't match his size. And here's a piece of history that got buried along with everything else in his career. During his junior year, Edwards and the Washington Huskies beat John Wooden's UCLA squad 103-81. That was the last defeat a Wooden-coached UCLA team ever suffered. Wooden retired after that season with his 10th national championship, and the final loss on his legendary record belonged to a team led by James Edwards. That fact alone should have followed Edwards for the rest of his life. Instead, it became a footnote that almost nobody repeated. He was later inducted into the University of Washington Husky Hall of Fame in 1990 and the State of Washington Sports Hall of Fame in 2015. The respect was real. It just always arrived quietly and late. A 7'1" center averaging over 20 points and 10 rebounds in college should have been a first-round pick. But on draft night in 1977, name after name was called before his, and Edwards kept sliding. The 1977 NBA draft did not treat James Edwards like a future 3-time champion. He sat and waited through the first round, then the second round. It wasn't until the third round, at pick number 46, that the Los Angeles Lakers finally called his name, 46th overall. For a man who would go on to play 19 seasons and win 3 rings, that draft position tells you everything about how the league saw him coming in. Useful, maybe, but not essential. Not a priority, not a star. The Lakers had Kareem Abdul-Jabbar anchoring the middle. Edwards was depth, insurance, a body. Then the season started and everything changed fast. In the opening game of the 1977-78 season, Kareem broke his hand. Not in the second month, not after the All-Star break, in the first minutes of the first game. And suddenly the rookie from Seattle, the third-round pick nobody was counting on, was the starting center for the Los Angeles Lakers. Edwards didn't flinch. Over the 21 games Kareem missed, the rookie averaged 17.1 points and 8.2 rebounds. He wasn't just filling a seat, he was producing at a level that made people in the building take notice. For a brief window, James Edwards looked like a player the Lakers could build around if they ever needed to, but they didn't need to. Kareem came back and Edwards returned to a reserve role. And before the season was over, a decision was made that had nothing to do with Edwards' game, and everything to do with one of the most violent moments in NBA history. The trade that sent Edwards out of Los Angeles wasn't about his performance. It was about the aftermath of an incident that shook the entire league and the desperate moves it forced the Lakers to make. On December 9, 1977, Kermit Washington threw a punch that changed the trajectory of multiple careers, including James Edwards's. During a game between the Lakers and the Houston Rockets, Washington struck Rudy Tomjanovich with a blow so devastating it shattered bones in Tomjanovich's face and nearly ended his life. The league suspended Washington for 60 days and fined him $10,000, but the fallout didn't stop there. The Lakers needed to move Washington out of Los Angeles. The public relations damage was enormous, and the franchise had to act. In the resulting trade, the Lakers sent Washington and James Edwards to the Indiana Pacers. In return, Los Angeles acquired Adrian Dantley. It was a deal designed to solve the Lakers' image problem, not to improve their front court. Edwards was an asset attached to a transaction that had nothing to do with him. Think about that for a moment. A rookie comes in, fills in for the greatest center in basketball, averages over 17 points, proves he belongs, and then gets shipped out because of someone else's violence. Edwards didn't throw the punch, he didn't cause the controversy, but he was the one who had to pack his bags and leave a franchise that was about to enter one of the greatest runs in NBA history. The Lakers would go on to win 5 championships in the 1980s with Magic Johnson and Kareem. Edwards would spend the next decade proving himself on teams nobody was watching. In Indiana, James Edwards would put up the best numbers of his entire career and discover that individual production on a losing team buys you even less recognition than being a role player on a winning one. If you want to know what James Edwards looked like when he was the man, look at Indiana. Over 4 seasons with the Pacers from 1977 to 1981, Edwards averaged 15.9 points and 7.5 rebounds per game. He became the franchise's highest scoring center, a real number 1 option in the post, not a backup, not a role player, not a specialist, the guy. But the Pacers of that era were a franchise still trying to figure out life after the ABA merger. The talent around Edwards was thin, the wins were hard to come by. Indiana was not a destination. It was a place careers went to be productive and invisible at the same time, and Edwards fit that description perfectly, through no fault of his own. There was one bright spot. In the 1980-81 season under coach Jack McKinney, the Pacers finally made the playoffs. It was the first postseason appearance for Indiana in the NBA, and Edwards was the anchor of that roster. But the celebration was short. Philadelphia swept them in the first round, and whatever momentum the franchise had built evaporated quickly. Edwards had proven he could produce at a high level. He had the stats, he had the durability, he had the size and the skill to be a starting center in the NBA for years to come. But none of it translated into national recognition. No all-star nod, no magazine covers, no primetime features. Just a big man putting up numbers in a small market while the rest of the league looked the other way. His next stop, Cleveland, would show him just how chaotic and undignified the business side of basketball could be, especially when the man signing the checks was more reckless than any player on the roster. James Edwards arrived in Cleveland still putting up numbers. In parts of 2 seasons with the Cavaliers from 1981 to 1983, he averaged 16 points and 7.4 rebounds per game. Same player, same production, same quiet professionalism. But the franchise around him was falling apart in ways that had nothing to do with basketball. The Cleveland Cavaliers under owner Ted Stepien were one of the most dysfunctional operations in professional sports history. Stepien had traded away first-round picks like they were spare change. He cycled through coaches the way most people change clothes. Attendance at the Coliseum had cratered. The fan base was disgusted, the front office was in chaos, and the money, the actual cash needed to run a professional basketball team, was drying up fast. Edwards found out exactly what that meant when the Cavaliers traded him to the Phoenix Suns along with a first-round draft pick. The return? $425,000 and other assets. That's it. The Cavaliers didn't move Edwards because they found a better center. They didn't trade him for a younger prospect or a strategic advantage. They sold him because Ted Stepien needed cash to make payroll. Let that settle for a moment. A starting center averaging 16 points a game, traded for operating money. Not because he was injured, not because he was a problem in the locker room, because the owner couldn't keep the lights on. The Stepien era became so infamous that the NBA eventually created a rule in his name, the Stepien Rule, which prevents teams from trading away first-round picks in consecutive years. That's the kind of owner Edwards was playing for. The kind of owner who leaves a stain so deep the league has to write new legislation to make sure it never happens again. For Edwards, though, the humiliation was personal and immediate. He was a commodity on a balance sheet, not a player on a roster. But he did what he always did. He packed his bags, moved to the next city, and got back to work. Phoenix was waiting, and for the first time in his career, something close to stability. After the chaos of Cleveland, Phoenix must have felt like solid ground. Edwards spent nearly 5 seasons with the Suns from 1983 to 1988, averaging 14.7 points and 5.6 rebounds per game. He was a reliable post scorer on a competitive roster, not the star, but a professional contributor who showed up every night and gave you exactly what you expected. For a man who had been a third-round draft pick, traded because of someone else's punch, and then sold for payroll by a broke franchise, Phoenix represented normalcy. Regular minutes, a functioning organization, a city where he could settle in and just play basketball without the ground shifting under his feet every few months. Then in April of 1987, the ground shifted again, and this time it had nothing to do with trades or bad owners. A Maricopa County grand jury indicted Edwards on 3 counts connected to a controlled substance investigation. The charges involved conspiracy related to possession and transfer of controlled substances. Fellow Sanjay Humphreys and teammate Grant Gundrezick were also named in the indictment. Former son Walter Davis received immunity in the case, though reports indicated his testimony did not produce decisive evidence. According to published accounts in the New York Times from April and September of that year, the case never went to trial. Edwards resolved the matter by completing a counseling program. There was no conviction, no prison time, no extended legal battle. The charges were addressed, the program was finished, and Edwards moved forward. But the stain was there. In an era when the league was actively fighting a public perception problem around substance issues, an indictment was not a small thing, even one that ended without trial. It added another layer to the quiet around Edwards' name. Teams could point to his production and trust his game. But the legal cloud made it easier for the public to look past him, and easier for the media to leave him out of conversations about the league's best big men. Edwards kept playing. He finished the season. He came back the next year. And in February of 1988, a trade sent him to Detroit, a franchise that was about to become the most feared team in basketball, and the one place where a quiet, tough, battle-tested center was exactly what the roster needed. When Edwards landed in Detroit in February of 1988, the Pistons were already on the edge of greatness. Isiah Thomas, Joe Dumars, Bill Laimbeer, Dennis Rodman, Rick Mahorn, Vinnie Johnson, the core was in place. What Detroit needed was another physical body in the front court. A big man who could score in the post, absorb contact without complaining, and fit into a locker room full of hard men without causing friction. Edwards was built for that job. 11 years in the league by then. He had played for bad teams and dysfunctional owners. He had survived a legal situation that could have derailed a lesser career. He wasn't fragile. He wasn't needy. He was a professional who understood his role, and the Pistons valued that more than anything a stat sheet could measure. His first taste of the postseason at this level came immediately. The Pistons reached the 1988 NBA Finals against the Los Angeles Lakers, the franchise that had drafted Edwards a decade earlier and traded him away. Detroit pushed the series to 7 games. In Game 6, Isiah Thomas turned in one of the most legendary performances in finals history, scoring 25 points in the third quarter alone on a severely sprained ankle. But the Lakers held on, and Detroit lost the series in 7. The heartbreak was real. The Pistons had been close enough to taste it, and the loss only sharpened their edge heading into the next season. For Edwards, the experience was different than anything he'd known. He had spent years producing on teams that went nowhere. Now he was on a roster built to win it all, surrounded by players who refused to accept anything less. The hunger in that locker room was unlike anything he had encountered in Indiana, Cleveland, or Phoenix. The 1988 Finals heartbreak only made the Pistons angrier, and the following season, James Edwards would finally get his hands on the thing that had eluded him for over a decade. The 1988-89 Pistons came back with a purpose that bordered on fury. They had lost the finals, they had watched the Lakers celebrate on their floor, and they were done waiting. Detroit rolled through the regular season and into the playoffs with the kind of defensive intensity that made opponents dread the matchup before the ball was even tipped. When the Pistons reached the finals again, this time against the Lakers for a rematch, there was no 7-game drama. Detroit swept Los Angeles 4-0. Joe Dumars won Finals MVP, and James Edwards, after 12 years in the league, finally had a championship ring on his finger. He was not the headliner, he was not the story, but he was there, contributing minutes, providing post-scoring off the bench, doing exactly what the coaching staff asked. In a locker room full of alpha personalities, Edwards was the steady hand that never demanded attention and never created problems. That kind of presence doesn't make highlights, but it wins championships. Then they did it again. In the 1989-90 season, Edwards stepped into an even larger role. He started 70 of 82 regular season games, not a bench player anymore, but a foundational piece of the rotation. The Pistons reached the finals against the Portland Trail Blazers, and in Game 2, Edwards delivered the kind of performance that should have cemented his name in the public memory. He scored 26 points, the team high, in a game Detroit lost by a single point. It was the best individual finals performance of his career, and it came on the biggest stage the sport offers. Detroit lost that game but won the series in 5, back-to-back champions. Edwards had 2 rings. He had started 70 games for a title team. He had led the scoring in a finals game. And still, when people talked about those Pistons, his name came last, if it came at all. 2 championships, 70 starts, a final scoring explosion, and within 2 years, Edwards would be gone from Detroit, beginning a long, slow journey through 4 more franchises in 5 seasons. The bad boy era didn't fade slowly. It collapsed. The Pistons were swept by Chicago in the 1991 Eastern Conference Finals, the moment the torch passed from Detroit to Jordan, and within a year, the roster that had terrorized the league was being dismantled piece by piece. Edwards was part of the teardown. His next stop was the LA Clippers for the 1991-92 season. From the back-to-back champions to the most consistently miserable franchise in professional basketball. That's the reality of being a role player in your mid-30s. You don't choose your landing spot. You go where someone answers the phone and offers a contract. The Clippers were not building toward anything. They were filling seats, barely, and Edwards was a body in a uniform on a team that existed mostly to lose. Then came something that might have felt poetic if the circumstances had been different. Edwards returned to the Los Angeles Lakers from 1992 to 1994, the same franchise that drafted him 46th overall back in '77. But this was not a victory lap. Magic Johnson had retired. The Showtime era was over. The Lakers were searching for an identity they wouldn't find for years, and Edwards was a veteran in his late 30s trying to squeeze out whatever minutes a rebuilding team would give him. After Los Angeles, he landed in Portland for the 1994-95 season. The numbers told the whole story, 2.7 points per game. At 39 years old, he was at the far edge of a roster, getting mop-up minutes while younger players ran past him. If you had asked anyone in the league whether James Edwards would play another NBA game after that Portland season, most would have said no. The career appeared finished, not with a dramatic ending, but with a quiet, expected wind-down that matched the way Edwards had always moved through the league. But on October 26, 1995, a phone rang. And on the other end was an invitation to join the most dominant team in NBA history for one final ride. The 1995-96 Chicago Bulls were not looking for James Edwards to save them. Michael Jordan had returned. Scottie Pippen was in his prime. Dennis Rodman, Edwards' old teammate from Detroit, had been added to the mix. The roster was stacked, the chemistry was lethal, and the front office was putting the final pieces in place for a run at history. Edwards signed with Chicago on October 26, 1995. He was 40 years old. He was 19 seasons deep. He averaged 3.5 points per game that year, and nobody on the planet expected more than that. His job was simple: be available, be professional, absorb a few minutes when the starters needed rest, and don't get in the way of greatness. He did exactly that. The Bulls went 72-10 that regular season, the best record in NBA history at the time. They rolled through the playoffs and won the championship, giving Edwards his third ring. He had now won titles in 3 different decades with 2 of the most iconic franchises the sport has ever produced. 1989 and 90 with Detroit, 1996 with Chicago, the Bad Boys and the Bulls, 2 dynasties. One quiet man standing inside both of them. Edwards played limited minutes throughout the season, but his presence in that locker room was not accidental. Phil Jackson wanted veterans who understood what it took to win at the highest level. Edwards had been through playoff wars, finals pressure, locker room politics, and franchise dysfunction. He didn't need a speech from the coaching staff to know how to behave in April and May. That institutional knowledge, earned across 8 franchises in nearly 2 decades, was worth more than whatever his stat line showed on any given Tuesday in January. When the final buzzer sounded on that championship, James Edwards walked away from basketball the same way he had played it, without fanfare, without a press conference, without anyone really noticing the exit. Edwards didn't disappear from basketball entirely. After retiring as a player, he returned to Detroit, the city where he had experienced his greatest glory, and served as an assistant coach with the Pistons. It was a natural fit. A man who had spent 19 years learning the game from every possible angle on every kind of roster had something to teach younger players about survival, professionalism, and what it actually takes to last. In 2015, the State of Washington Sports Hall of Fame inducted Edwards, a formal recognition from the place where it all started. Combined with his earlier induction into the University of Washington Husky Hall of Fame in 1990, the honors confirmed what the people closest to his career already knew. James Edwards belonged in the conversation about Washington State's greatest basketball products. The rest of the country just never joined that conversation. His post-playing life followed the same pattern as his career. No controversy, no public feuds, no desperate attempts to stay in the spotlight. Edwards settled into a life that reflected the same temperament that earned him the nickname Buddha: calm, measured, unbothered by the fact that louder voices got more attention. But the question at the center of this story was never really about James Edwards alone. It was about something bigger: 19 seasons, 3 rings, 8 teams, and a career so quiet that most basketball fans couldn't pick James Edwards out of a lineup if you gave them 3 guesses. That's not a failure. That's a reflection of how we build stories in sports. We remember the man who hit the last shot, not the man who set the screen. We remember the voice in the press conference, not the professional who answered his questions in 2 sentences and walked to the bus. We remember the poster, the shoe deal, the nickname that fits on a headline. Buddha didn't fit any of those frames, and he never tried to. Edwards played in an era when centers were kings: Kareem, Hakeem, Patrick, Moses, Shaq at the tail end. The position was stacked with legends who commanded every camera in the building. Edwards was never going to outshine those names, but he outlasted a lot of them. He was still collecting paychecks and winning championships when players drafted 10 years after him were already retired. There's a version of basketball history that only celebrates the extraordinary: the 60-point games, the MVP trophies, the rivalries that sell documentaries,